Tucker Carlson interviewed Vladimir Putin, and everybody's losing their minds. The White House said we should not believe anything Vladimir Putin says during the Tucker Carlson interview. Vlad could say the sky is blue, and the White House would be like, eh.
Remember, you're listening to Vladimir Putin, and you shouldn't take at face value anything he has to say.
Esteemed political journal Politico has had a meltdown as well. They have said that Putin had lied throughout this interview. In reference to the motivation for invading Ukraine, Politico reported that Putin said in the Tucker Carlson interview, quote, "It's not that America was going to launch a surprise attack on Russia. I didn't say that." Politico said he's wrong because, quote, he did say that. Politico cited this statement from Putin 3 days before the Russian invasion. Quote, "We also know who the main adversary for the US and NATO is. It's Russia. In NATO documents, our country is officially and directly declared the main threat to Euro-Atlantic security, and Ukraine will serve as the advanced foothold for such an attack." He didn't say the thing they said he said. Russia is deemed a security threat. That's true. And if Ukraine is a NATO ally and a close country between Europe and Russia, it would be the spot for the attack. If one were to happen, that's very different from saying we invaded Ukraine because a US attack was imminent. The next lie that Politico said Putin made is that Ukraine legislated a ban on negotiating with Russia. Politico said Putin's wrong on that because Zelensky signed a decree banning negotiations specifically with Putin, not Russia as a country. Quote, "With this Russian president, it is impossible. He doesn't know what dignity and honesty are. We are ready for a dialogue with Russia, but with a different president." That's what Zelensky said. Putin's the leader of the country. Who else would they negotiate with? If someone said, "We refuse to negotiate with the president of the United States, and we want them to have a different president, and we'll negotiate with them," and the president of the United States said, "Hey, that country's refusing to negotiate with us," we'd be like, yeah, that's accurate. If Russia was like, get a new president and send us someone who's more pro-Russia to negotiate on behalf of the United States, the State Department would laugh in their face. So let's talk about propaganda, why don't we? Let's start with what Politico said next. This tells us a lot about the mindset of the writers at Politico. This quote from Putin was, "In the war of propaganda, it is very difficult to defeat the United States because the United States controls all the world's media and many European media. The ultimate beneficiaries of the biggest European media are American financial institutions." Politico said this is wrong because, quote, "The biggest news media companies are privately owned and operate without direct government control, in contrast to the state-controlled media landscape in Russia." Does Politico not think private institutions are capable of propaganda? Do they think they have no incentive to push propaganda? When the oil market was in flux and gas prices soared following the sanctions imposed on Russia by the United States because they invaded Ukraine, was it not private oil companies that made record profits? It's just silly because of the simple fact that propaganda was made by and for private corporate interests in the United States. Edward Bernays, known as the father of propaganda, born in the 1800s, wrote the book Propaganda. He was the architect of the 1920s Torches of Freedom marketing campaign to advertise cigarettes to women. It was so effective, his own wife pulled out a pack of cigarettes from her bedside table and started smoking one, and he tore them up because he knew they were bad for her. He then got hired to work for the United Fruit Company in the 1950s, connected with the CIA-orchestrated overthrow of the democratically elected Guatemalan government in 1954. For a long time, United Fruit Company had agreements with the dictator Jorge Ubico, who ran the Guatemalan economy in a feudalistic manner. United Fruit Company paid almost no taxes, faced no labor oversight. John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State at the time. He spent decades as the company's private lawyer before taking office. I should also mention his brother Alan Dulles was the head of the CIA at the time. Both worked for the international law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, of which United Fruit Company was a client. So, United Fruit owned over 500,000 acres of land in Guatemala, and the country was small. This was a lot of the arable land in Guatemala. They did not use 85% of it, saying it was on reserve, but really they just didn't want competition.
Dulles was the most important and best paid corporate lawyer in America. He had been spending decades at very famous New York law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, where he represented not just United Fruit and International Nickel, but just about every giant American multinational corporation. So he was steeped in this idea that American interest and the interest of multinational corporations were very much the same.
Eventually, the Guatemalans moved towards democracy, which supposedly the United States is like all about spreading abroad. But this guy, Jacobo Arbenz, gets elected and says anyone with land unused has to sell it back to the government at the value estimated on their taxes. United Fruit Company had had enough. They had undervalued their land on their tax reports so they could pay very low taxes. So this was like a very unpopular policy for them. Sam Zamuri, Sam the Banana Man, he was head of United Fruit. He hires our boy, Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew. They used radio propaganda to start a fake uprising in Guatemala. They used CIA planes painted like Guatemalan Air Force planes, and they were bombing military bases to give people the idea that there was an internal revolution. They made fake tapes in Miami to sound like opposing forces and broadcasted those on the radio in Guatemala.
Guatemala was engaged in an attempt to build a social democracy, in trying to transform itself from a feudal state into a modern capitalist state. Now, we thought they were being manipulated by the Kremlin. That was the argument that the Dulles brothers, Alan and John Foster Dulles, used. And in fact, Dulles himself said that, well, while we have no evidence that the Kremlin is manipulating Guatemala, we are acting on the basis of the assumption that it must be true.
In the end, Arbenz was forced to resign, and he gave a farewell speech. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is all evidenced in declassified CIA documents. The United States' biggest export is propaganda.